Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Conscious Grief Series 5. Today, I am joined by Brian Smith from Grief to Growth. I'm really excited about this conversation, and welcome to Conscious Grief Series, Brian.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Maybe to begin with, rather than reading out your bio, you could introduce yourself to the listeners about how you came to work and create Grief to Growth.
Okay, well, that's kind of a long story, so I'll try to make it short. It started off for me. I started off with toxic religion. I grew up in a home where I was taught about a vengeful God who was judging us, was going to send us to hell, all that kind of stuff. So that created a fear of death for me, and to the point where I would call it thanatophobia, where I would have panic attacks all the time, from the time I was a teenager until I was in my probably late 20s, early 30s, suffering from this panic, this fear of death. So what I did to overcome that was I started to study everything I could find about death. And I'm a very analytical person. So I'm a chemical engineer by training. So I want to know, like, how does this work? And, I was taught the Bible says this, but then science says something completely different. So which is true, and how can we know what's true? So I studied that for many, many years. But then in 2015, my 15-year-old daughter, Shayna, passed away suddenly. She was playing volleyball. She was a volleyball player. She was very healthy, outgoing, active, great academics, best starter you could hope for. And she passed away suddenly in her sleep. So this is when you're thinking, okay, I got to take all the stuff that I've learned. I have to apply it to my life now. I've got to figure out, how does this really work practically on a day-to-day basis when you're thinking you're going to have the rest of your life with your daughter and she's suddenly taken away. So I found an organization called Helping Parents Heal. Someone introduced me to Mark Ireland, who's one of the co-founders of Helping Parents Heal. Mark had written a couple of books. He graciously sent the books to me. I was like, this is an organization I want to be part of. So I volunteered with Helping Parents Heal, and I've been with them now for probably about 8 years. And about 4 years ago, after working with all these parents that I worked with, because I was leading the meetings and the online Zoom meetings with parents and interviewing people for the organization, I said, well, now that I've got all this background, I understand death from the fear of death I had before. I understand loss from losing my daughter. And I worked with all these people. Let me formalize that. So I wrote the book, Grief to Growth, and became a life coach. And that's what I do now, is I help people work through the process of growing from grief.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It's a fascinating journey. I know you've summarized it beautifully for us, but it is really interesting how you had that fear of death and the fundamental Christianity teachings, which I guess fueled that fear. Like, I too relate to that, because I was always transfixed on heaven and hell, from the teachings I had when I was younger. And then I'd love to honor the photo of Shayna that you have behind you. It's a beautiful photo. And I'm so sorry, that you've had to endure that loss of Shayna at such a young age. But I do know Helping Parents Heal, and it is an amazing community. And maybe you could share a little bit about Helping Parents Heal for people who've never heard about them, and what they stand for, and how it's quite transformative in terms of you keeping your relationship with your children going.
Yeah, it's extremely transformative. Helping Parents Heal is an organization that's been around for, I'm going to get this wrong, but see, probably 14 years, something in that range, I think. Over 20,000 parents now are part of the organization. It's international, worldwide. We meet online through Facebook and through Zoom meetings. Helping Parents Heal, it's interesting. We call ourselves a non-dogmatic organization, and we are non-dogmatic. We don't have any particular religious beliefs or anything. But I tell people, if you join the organization, one of the things that's a theme is continuing bonds. We believe that our children are still with us. We believe our children are motivators, or we know they're motivators in our life. A term that Suzanne Giesemann coined was shining light parents. And what it means, it's got dual meaning. One is that our children are shining lights. So we're parents of these shining lights, these people that go on in spirit and still inspire us every day. But we hope to become shining lights ourselves. So we went away from, we used to use the term bereaved parents, which is a term that most of us just can't stand because we don't want to stay bereaved forever. It's fine to be bereaved early on, but we don't want to stay that way. And we don't believe our children want us to either. So I live for my daughter in a very large sense. The picture behind me, it's not just symbolic. I believe that Shana and I work together. We are partners in this business. She's the reason why I do what I do. So that's why I put the picture there to honor her. In fact, funny story, when I was first getting on Zoom, I was using a fake background and it had a photo in it, an image, and someone asked me one day if that was my daughter. And I just heard Shana saying to me, okay, that should be me. So when I replaced her, the other woman in it with Shana, and then this is a live backdrop now, but I was like, I've got to put that picture of Shana up. So that's why she's there.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much for explaining that. And you talked about just now continuing bonds.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so maybe you could begin with just sharing with the listeners, what that means, that theory, continuing bonds.
Yeah, it's interesting for me because as I've studied this over the years, I think in the early days, I think for all of mankind's existence, we believed that we were spirit beings and we go on, our ancestors are with us and all those types of things. A couple hundred years ago, we became very materialistic and that kind of fell out of favor. And even in the grief community, what they said to people was basically, you have an attachment, you have an unhealthy attachment to something that you can't have anymore. So get over it, be realistic, let that person go. So it was all about letting go. It's all about breaking that attachment. I don't believe that works. I think in our hearts that we know that we are spirit beings and we still have that desire for our loved one. So whether you believe it literally that your loved one is still with you or you're honoring their memory, that bond continues. The love doesn't die when the person's body stops functioning. So continuing bonds honors that. And in my work with people, I try to help them understand that it's not just a nice thing. It's not just a thing that we're saying to fool ourselves. It's actually true that our loved ones are still with us, that we will see them again. And that continuing bond, it doesn't eliminate the grief, but it makes it a lot easier to deal with.
Yes, I couldn't agree more, that we can continue these relationships. And as you said, it's because sort of culturally we were taught a few hundred years ago, different theories came forward in the Industrial Revolution where it was like, you gotta, stay calm and carry on type thing in order to be efficient in the workforce and, create capitalism basically. And, grief is not something that's controllable or efficient, maybe. So that was a way of trying to make it controllable and efficient by saying to people, you have to move on and not be sad and waste time. And unfortunately, that's not helpful at all because we keep it all bottled up and suffer in the process. And I think that when people start to have the understanding that you can keep the memories alive, you can keep the relationship going. And also if you are open to the fact that they are still here in spirit form. And that's really, what Helping Parents Heal is about, is that there's a lot of, they've written a whole book on all the signs that you have from children from the other side. And there's a lot of mediums who are in that community who are constantly giving readings to the parents. So there's a huge feeling of hope. And as you said, it's like not staying in the bereaved parent, like stuck in that grief, that you can still have a very beautiful, hopeful, happy, joyful life as a parent who's lost a child.
Yeah, I think hope is the most important thing about being a human being. We have to feel like tomorrow's going to be a better day. That there's a chance at least that something better is going to happen. And the continuing bonds thing does give us hope. I found when Shayna passed, we tend to get stuck in the past, right? All we want to think about is what we had, and then when we think about the future, all we're thinking about is what we're going to miss, and that's what really exacerbates grief. Is that it's that feeling of loss, that feeling of losing that future. So what this does is says, yeah, I can have a different relationship with her. It's not exactly the same, and it doesn't mean that I don't grieve, but I still have a relationship with them, and I'm going to see her again. So it also gives you something to look forward to, as opposed to wandering the earth the rest of the days of your life, feeling terrible.
Yeah, absolutely. And for people who might be listening to this, and for example, it could be somebody who lost their parent when they were a
Mhm.
baby, and they may argue with you and say, well, I can't, how do I have a continuing bond with somebody who I don't have any memory of? What
Mhm.
would you say to somebody like that?
I'll try to keep this brief, but first of all, grief comes from the perceived loss of a bond. So if you don't have a bond, you're not going to grieve. So if I read an obituary of someone I never knew, I'm not going to grieve. I'm not going to have an emotional reaction to that because there's no perceived loss. For that person who's lost a parent before that they were born, their grief is going to be based upon whatever they feel like that bond is. And I don't have that experience, but I know people that don't know their fathers, for example, and they still have this connection, this feeling of wanting something. There's still a feeling of loss there. So I would argue that there is some sort of a bond there, and that we can continue that bond, and in fact we can enhance that bond. Are the people that have passed, and I notice I've hardly ever used the word died because our bodies die, but we don't die as people. But people who have transitioned, we can still have relationships with them. It's never too late to talk to them, telepathically, to meditate and bring them into our meditations. We can contact them through things like mediums. So we can still continue to have that bond. The thing about continuing bonds, as I said, it's important if someone feels like they have a bond with that person, they can continue it, as opposed to the old way of dealing with grief was the bond is broken, they're gone, just forget about it and move on. So that's the contrast.
And what a stark contrast that is, just when you say those words, like you've got to get over it, you've got to move on, like it just feels like so heavy, just hearing you say that.
Hmm.
And that there's no sense of hope. And, for our psyche to get round that. And that really is the message that many, many of us have received. And even I've heard people say, they were just crying and crying and crying over the death of their mother. And their partner just was like, this has to stop. You have to, I can't cope with this anymore. And it's just so painful for people to
Hmm.
hear that you're not allowed to have your grief. But also
Yeah.
they wouldn't have had the understanding about this theory of continuing bonds, which is so powerful.
Yeah. And it's something I want to say about that because sometimes people will tell us you have to get over it. You have to move on for various reasons. One is it makes other people feel uncomfortable when you're sad, frankly. So they want to cheer you up so they don't have to feel uncomfortable. Sometimes religion will tell you you're not allowed to grieve because you should have faith, and so people that have faith don't express, bad emotions. And in fact, I was just talking with someone yesterday who's lost a son, and some people in the religious community were telling them, like at the service, no crying, no tears. That is extremely harmful. And we have to remember that even if you're a Christian, Jesus cried. So it's okay to express any emotion. Even if we believe in these continuing bonds, which I absolutely do, I still have times when I cry. I still have times when I miss my daughter. I miss, having her here physically. Um, so we don't want to tell people you have to bypass the feelings. It's okay to have the feelings. In fact, it's very important to express any feelings you have, to acknowledge the feelings that you have. And it could be anger, fear, frustration, guilt, all types of things come along with grief. So we want to express those things, but we still want to hold on to that hope that we know that they're okay.
And like you said earlier, love never dies.
Absolutely not. Yeah, absolutely not. And anybody that's lost someone that close to them will tell you that the love has not died. That person might not physically be here anymore, but that bond is as strong as ever. And some people have even said grief is love with no place to go. And I think that's very important because I believe that's true. But when we have somewhere to put our love, when we can picture that person happy, healthy, and whole, then that can, I don't want to say eliminate the grief, but it can mitigate the grief.
Yes, it's an interesting quote, that one, isn't it? Because I know that a lot of it's sort of a bit of a Marmite, we say here in England. Some people love it, some people really don't like it. Because some people say grief is not just love. Grief can be anger and resentment and rage and a lot of other things, not just love, which is just an interesting perspective.
Yeah, well, the love is what produces all those other things. So I would say that the love is the core of what grief does not equal love. That's absolutely true. But it's the love that creates the grief. Again, if you don't have the love for someone, you don't grieve them. If I read an obituary of a stranger, I'm not going to grieve them. Not much anyway. I might have some compassion, but when it's the deeper the love, the more the grief is going to be, or the more likely you're going to go through that grief experience. And grief is, I can't remember, I like to give people credit. I can't remember who said it, but he said, grief is not an emotion, it's a container for emotions. So grief, it comes in all different forms: anger, fear, resentment, fear, you name it. It's just all these things. And you bounce around between them. You feel like you're going crazy. Even numbness. Sometimes you get so overwhelmed with emotion that you don't feel anything. So all those things come and are encompassed by grief, but it's produced by the fact that you have that love for that person and that perceived loss of the bond.
I love what you're sharing, and going back to that phrase, grief is love with no place to go. So in your, from what I understand from reading your work on your website, when you coach people, part of it is, I'm sure most people are coming to you with grief, but maybe not everybody, because you have an amazing skill set. You mentioned that some people, it's about finding your purpose and your calling. Like each of us have a purpose for being here. And so thinking about like somebody like yourself who comes with a bereavement, a significant loss where you've had all this love for somebody, but you don't have that person to give it to anymore. There's like a space maybe in your life. So yeah, maybe you could talk to us a little bit more about your coaching and working with people to find their purpose or find their place where they can put their love.
Yeah, when I work with people, there are like, I guess, three things I think are really important for us to understand as human beings, like where we came from, where we're going, and why we're here. These are the deep questions of life. And if we can answer those, I think we can get over some of the angst that we go through. So I try to help people understand that you are a spirit being. You are an eternal being. You were never born and you will never die. You come into this life and you leave this life, but that's not your beginning or your ending. There's one life, there's one continuous life. So while I'm here, what am I here to do? And I believe that everything serves a purpose. Now, some people say that everything is predestined. That's an interesting thing to think about. But whether it is or it's not, human beings, we can give purpose to things. We can give meaning to things. So when people say my loved one died, they passed away, I'm like, but is there something good that can come from that? Can you create something from that? And I've interviewed hundreds of people at this point now, And these people are all people almost exclusively who have said, yes, I've taken this tragedy, this bad thing, and I've turned it into something else. That's the beauty of the human spirit. Not only that, I believe human beings come here to have these tragedies. We come here to have these challenges to overcome. And that sounds crazy the first time you hear it. But when we think about it, human beings, we do set out challenges for ourselves. We play sports. We climb mountains. We do all kinds of things that we don't have to do just so we can overcome them. So I try to help people, can we frame this in a way like, what if you and your loved one planned this? What if there's some purpose in it? Can you picture them right now happy, healthy, and whole? I believe there are two components to grief. One is we grieve for our loss of relationship with that person, and we grieve for their perceived loss. Oh, they're never going to grow old. They're never going to get married. They're never going to see their grandchildren. All those things. Well, you can set aside the grieving for their loss because they're home. They're happy. They're healthy. They're whole. They're not missing anything. So if we can set that aside, that reduces the burden some. So what I try to do is help people. How do we reduce the burden? How do we make this bearable in the first early days? I was just talking with someone yesterday who lost a son just over a month ago. At that point, all the stuff about purpose and, greater meaning and silver linings, no. At this point, we're trying to survive. We're just trying to get through. Later on, we can talk about growing, but the first phase is just surviving. So depending on where people are, I work with them to reframe, to understand that, your loved one is they're physically gone. And I'm just thinking about this conversation I had yesterday because someone had just brought their son's ashes to the house like that day. And that's one of those finality things, because when we identify with the body, we're like, that's them. And I always try to tell people that's not them. That's the vessel, the remnants of the vessel that they were in, but they left that vessel behind. So I'm going on and like, this is the mindset I try to give to people. When I picture Shayna with her grandmother, her grandfather, my grandparents, our dog that passed away a little bit after Shayna did. That's how I picture her. I don't picture her as a body in a casket or as ashes in an urn.
Yeah, I know. I think that's so helpful, everything you're explaining, but some people listening will be very resistant, to hearing
Sure.
this. And as you say, it's everybody responds differently. And of course, we have this spiritual belief that brings us a huge amount of comfort in knowing that we are spiritual beings having a human experience. And it is such a sensitive topic, with some people who that's a very out there concept, that they've never come across that before. When I started seeing life from that perspective, it was like, whoa, it just helped me so much. I, like you, had grown up in different sorts of Christian churches, to be honest, at different times.
Mm-hmm.
And I always thought this was the one life. And, I felt guilty for everything. I was always trying to be good and do everything right because I wanted to go to heaven. But then I thought, my God, everyone I know is probably going to go to hell. Yeah. Everyone's going to be a lonely place.
Exactly. Yeah.
And when I started to understand this soul journey, that we all come here, that we can, when you talked about reframing, like looking at things from a different perspective, that we came here to have hard experiences. I kept thinking, I was very in a victim place because I was like, why did my parents die? Why me? Why did this happen? Did I do something wrong? Am I a bad person? Because a lot of bad things happening to me,
Right.
And then trying to overcompensate with being good to stop more bad things happening.
Right.
When you get the understanding that, oh no, this is all to help me evolve and grow. Wow, that's a really empowering place to live your life.
It absolutely is. And, I want to, you said some people might be resistant to this, and I understand that. So I'm a very rational, analytical person. My degree is in chemical engineering. So I'm a show me kind of person. And I'm still skeptical to this day. So what I also do with people is like, I don't ask you to believe anything I tell you. I will show you the evidence. I have worked with mediums. I have had medium readings. I've seen medium readings. I know that mediumship is real. Now, are there fakes? Absolutely. Are there people who shouldn't call themselves mediums who think they are? Absolutely. But it is real. Instrumental transcommunication. I know it's real. It's documented. Things like remote viewing, the government has studied. ESP, the government has studied. We know these things have been proven in the lab, over and over again. Precognition. So all these things that I'm talking about, they have been documented to a certain extent. People have been told that it's all woo-woo, that it's all wishful thinking, and that is a lie. Frankly, it's a materialistic mindset that is actually it's a belief in itself. And materialistic atheists, and I would say materialistic as opposed to just being atheists, but people that think the material is all there is, that is actually a philosophy. And people have been told, oh, that's just scientific. But it's not true. And science is starting to understand that. We're having experiments now, the double slit experiment, which I don't go into detail, but people can look that up. But it shows that consciousness has an effect on the material world. Quantum mechanics shows that the world is not as deterministic as people think it is. So these things are science, I believe, is starting to come back around. And I just want to end this with just one little thing. I was talking to a friend, and she was total skeptic. I would say skeptic because she was somewhat open, but total materialist. There's nothing to this afterlife stuff. All mediums are frauds. She said, Brian, you've studied this a lot. Send me to the best medium you know. I'm going to prove to myself once for all this isn't true. So I gave her the name of someone who I know to be a great medium. She used a fake credit card, our friend's credit card. She gave a fake name. This medium told her everything about herself and her husband who had passed away. She came back to me. She said, no, this is real. So I started giving her some resources to read, and she starts reading them. She came back to me and she said, why didn't I know any of this was out there? And I said, because people haven't told you. There's so much proof of what I preach, for lack of a better word. It's not, I don't just say it's because it's wishful thinking. There's evidence of it for real.
And why do you think that we don't commonly have this understanding in our culture?
Mankind got so enamored with our scientific knowledge that we thought, in our hubris, we don't need God, for lack of a better word. We don't need that. We don't need to rely on that. Those are fairy tales that we told ourselves for thousands of years so we wouldn't be scared in the dark. But now we're going to grow up and we're going to face reality. So I think it's that mentality, that mindset that we can do it on our own. We don't need a guide. We don't need spirituality, which is really interesting because I think it's built into all of us. And that's what one of the things that's lacking in the world today is so many people that don't have the understanding that we're all one, why we're here, where we're going, and that's why we're as selfish as we are. That's why we do the things that we do, and why there's so much loneliness. Frankly, loneliness is a major epidemic right now. People, and it's weird because we're more connected than ever in some ways, but people don't feel that connection. So I think it's frankly a matter of hubris. I think it was a matter of we're gonna put aside all these fairy tales. You and I were taught Christianity. I was taught it in a very literal way. And when people read the Bible literally, at some point they say, this isn't true. There was no talking snake, and Noah couldn't have possibly put 7 million animals on the ark. And so they reject the whole thing. And when they reject the whole thing, they reject what they perceive as God too. And they say, well, there must be some explanation for this beauty that we find around us, this incredible universe and the human spirit. There's got to be some natural explanation for it. We just haven't found it yet. And so I think it's that.
Also, it's funny how a lot of the time people will say, oh, if there was a God, why would all these terrible things happen? That's sort of a common thing you hear, isn't it? But it's like, well, no, why do we have this fairy tale in our head that our lives or the planet or human beings should be a certain way and bad things shouldn't happen, and parents should outlive their children, and we have this sort of sense of belief in our minds, and it's like, well, no, this is life. This is part of life,
It's a really interesting question, and it's as old as mankind, the Odyssey, right? Why, if there's a good God, why do bad things happen? And we've wrestled with it forever. And I always reframe the question: what are you calling bad? Bad is a judgment. When something happens, there is no good or bad until we assign meaning to it. And so we perceive it as bad because it's something that we don't want. And so what I try to do is, again, help people reframe. What do you mean you don't want it? From what perspective? You're coming from the perspective of right now, right here, right now. So I'll say to people, name something bad that's happened in your life. Maybe you got divorced when you were younger. How did that turn out? Did anything good come from that? Well, yeah, I learned from that. I learned I don't want to be with another person like that. I learned to stand up for myself. I learned, whatever. You got fired from a job. I got fired from a job. My daughter was 9 months old. Thought it was the worst thing that ever happened to me. Long story short, ended up getting a job making 3 times as much money. And I would have never left that job because it was comfortable if I hadn't been fired. So even as we look back in the course of our very short lives, we can see that sometimes what we perceived was bad turned out to be good. So what if we can take that to the next higher perspective, and now you're sitting there and you're in spirit and you've had your life, and you see that your mother passed away when you were 12 years old, but it made you a stronger person, and it made you grow into yourself. It made you a more compassionate person. You then went on to work with orphans, and you touched millions of people. And when you see it from that perspective, which people that have near-death experiences do, and they tell us this is true, they go, oh, that's why that happened. So what I try to get people to do is let's just hold off on judging things. Let's just hold off on saying this is bad or this is good. This just is. What am I going to do with it? What meaning am I going to assign to it?
Yeah, such a great answer. When you were talking there, you said the word resilience. What can you tell us about, resilience in grief?
I still wrestle with, does grief make us resilient, or does grief expose the resilience that we already have? And I think it's both. It's interesting because people say to me, I couldn't survive if my daughter passed away. I don't know how you survived what you survived. Well, I interview people that have lost multiple children. I'm actually, there's a friend of mine, she's just written a book. While her husband had dementia, she was working with her husband with dementia, her son passed away. I've talked to people who have multiple losses, fires, divorces, et cetera, gone through all kinds of stuff. The human spirit is so resilient. And I think again, these challenges help us to reveal that. And they help us also to grow that resilience also, because it's kind of like a muscle. We have to exercise it. So when we're in spirit, we're like, okay, I wonder what it would be like if I went through that. I want to give that a shot. I want to see what it's like to lose a daughter, and how will I respond to that? So resilience is a big part of why I think we're here to grow. We're here to prove to ourselves that we're strong. It's funny because people talk, again, in our faith, God testing people. Well, why would God have to test me? Because God should know. God knows everything, right? But it's more like I'm going to let you test yourself. I'm going to show you how strong you are. And when we overcome something like that, and I one more thing I would say, but when I always use the video game analogy, because Shane and I love video games. And when you're designing video games, you have to make them easy, and you want to make them hard enough that it's a challenge, but not so hard that people give up on it. And if you make it too easy, people won't play the game, because it's like, if I just got coins for pressing a button, I'd play twice and then I'd quit. So I think we design these challenges because if you've ever played a video game, you get to a level that's really, really hard, and you play that boss over and over and over again. When you finally beat him, the exhilaration is just like crazy. And I think that's what it's like in this life too. I think when we pass in the spirit, we go, wow, that was crazy. You know, I went through cancer, I went through divorce, I lost a child, I lost my job. That was really wild, but look how it turned out.
It's funny because I use the sort of like life is like a theme park, and some
Mhm.
chapters we get on the sweet ride, like a small world, and others we're on the very scary one. And
Yeah. Yeah, great. That's a great analogy, right? So exactly, you're at Disney World, you get on the teacups because you want to take a little break, but then you're like, okay, well, now I want to get on the roller coaster. And think about roller coasters. Why do we build roller coasters? I mean, you're scared that you think you're going to die. It's no good unless you think you're going to die.
Yeah.
So I think all of these things are little glimpses into the human spirit, and that hopefully will help people understand because it's inevitable. People say, "I would have never chosen this." No, not this. I might have chosen, something else, but I wouldn't have chosen this.
hmm I know, and I mean, it's such a big topic that I could say many, many other circumstances, but yeah, I love this conversation for the soul journey in particular, and I have called this, conscious grief.
Mhm.
And I like to ask people, how would you define conscious grief?
I think conscious grief is, first of all, not hiding from your grief. People sometimes will try to tamp it down and pretend it doesn't exist or hide the feelings. So it's leaning into it. I've found it's for me, you have to lean into it. You have to recognize that you have to look at grief as a companion. Some people ask me, well, will I ever get over my grief? And I'm over. No, I don't think we're here to get over it. It's a companion. It'll be with you for as long as you loved your loved one. David Kessler puts it like, is how long people ask me how long they're going to grieve. So how long is your loved one going to be dead? Very blunt way of putting it, I think. But conscious grief is leaning into it. It's like, what can I do with this? It's like holding it in your hand and saying, okay, this is what I've been given. What am I going to do with it? How am I going to let this transform me? Because it's going to transform you. And some people say, you can get bitter or you can get better. And I've seen people take their grief and just hold on to it for 10 years or more, and it just turns into anger, and they just get more and more bitter. That is a choice. The conscious choice would be to say, I'm going to lean into this. I'm going to face this. I'm going to take this and I'm going to transform it into maybe even something beautiful. I talked to a person that abused terribly as a child by two members of her family. And, this person says, I'm grateful for that. That is like next level. That is beyond when you can be grateful even for the abuse because it made you who you are. And this doesn't mean that we excuse the abuser. It doesn't mean that abuse is okay. I'm not saying any of that. But this is a thing that happened. I can choose how I react to it. That's conscious grief.
Yeah, absolutely. And in light of what you just shared around that person, they've obviously really consciously healed what happened to them. To be able to come out the other side and say that and love every part of themselves as they are now. Thank you for that, Brian. This has been a wonderful conversation. I know that you have a free gift, and also to tell the viewers that you have many amazing resources on your website. You've written how many books?
I've actually only written one book. I've produced a lot of material, but only one book.
Okay, because it looked like there was quite a few different things to download.
Oh, yes, I have quite a few things to download. So yeah, if you go to my website, grief the numeral 2 growth.com, there I do have free gifts there that you can download. Some mini books. Only one book I have for sale though, but those are things that you can get, they're for free.
Amazing. Thank you. And your gift for the listeners of this series? You have an ebook that's going to outline 4 daily practices that have helped you through your darkest times.
Yeah, my book, Gems. There's 4 things that I do. I still literally do every day, and I've been doing them for the last 9 years. So I outline those things. The 4 things you can do in just a few minutes. It doesn't take a lot of time out of your day. and incorporate them into your daily routine. So that's available.
Oh, that's amazing. You know, for people who haven't maybe got a spiritual practice right now and are thinking, what could I do to start one? We will have a link to that below this interview. Anything else you would like to just share before we say goodbye?
No, I want to say I'm grateful for you having had me here. I hope that this helps someone to move along with their journey, to think about reframing everything that happens to you. It's a matter of your choice as to how you react to it, and to be conscious about those choices.
It sure is. Our obstacles are opportunities. Yeah. Thank you so much, Brian. It's been a real pleasure to meet you. I'm so grateful. And thanks to everybody who has been watching or listening. Bye for now. Bye.